Hey guys, and welcome. So, a great way to showcase and practice your developer skills is to create your own portfolio from scratch. This is especially true for self taught programmers like myself and newbies with a good grasp of the basics. Yes, starting from scratch takes longer than using a platform like WordPress or Wix. However, you will learn a great deal during the process. And honestly, that's really the name of the game. You learn, you show, and you grow. And in this tutorial, I will be teaching you how to build a portfolio site with a blog component using Next.js, GraphCMS, and Tailwind CSS. So let's get started. Okay, so first thing we are going to do is set up Graph CMS. So if you do not have an account, you would obviously need to create an account and you would just click get started. You can use whichever credential you would like to sign up with or register with Graph CMS. I personally just use GitHub. I was fine with the permissions and I moved on from there. So I will log in the same way with GitHub. All right. So first things first, we're going to start with a blank project. Now, GraphCMS does have some starter templates that you can use with other frameworks, which once you get comfortable using the GraphCMS platform, you can definitely go ahead and peruse those templates. But for now, we are going to start with a blank project. We're going to give the project a name. I'm going to call it Portfolio and Blog. We're going to give it a description, portfolio and blog tutorial. And then we are going to select the region for the data center of our choice to host our project. I am in Atlanta, Georgia, so I'm going to choose US East, North Virginia. You should choose whichever location makes sense geographically for you. And then we're going to click create project. And it may take some time. Nothing crazy. All right. So once we selected our data center, we are going to select our plan. Free forever is perfect for us right now. But as you continue to create these amazing projects, you may want to scale up, and Graph CMS has options for that. But for now, we are going to select free forever. If you have team members, good to know. If you have team members, you can invite them to your project now. We do not. So we'll just skip this and click invite later. Let me close this out. So once you get through all of those preliminary steps, you'll get to what is pretty much like your dashboard screen. And at the top, we're gonna start with these, what I like to call kind of like quick start steps, because we're literally going to follow it, maybe not literally, but we're going to pretty much follow these steps in order to a T to an extent. But as you go down the page, again, you can see that you can invite team members at this point. You get your project stats. You also have links to different documentation. Personally, I think Graph CMS has great documentation, both written content as well as videos to help get you started and to also help you understand how to use the platform. So I highly encourage going to check out their documentation and support content. All right, so we're going to scroll to the top. So the first step is to set up our schema. So we're gonna create our schema or configuration, and our schema is gonna be defined by the models we create and the fields we add to those models. And for this project, we are going to need three models. We're gonna need three models, and those three models will be author, posts, and projects. And we're going to start with author. And also, we see a nice little helper pop up shows up whenever you use a platform. Again, if you need to look at that video, go ahead and look at it. Right now, we're going to click remind me later. So let's start with our author model and let's create the model. So we're going to give it a display name, which I'm just going to call it author. So this is going to be our model for the authors for different blog posts. And we're going to give it a description. This is a small project and it's a personal project. So descriptions may be a little overkill. However, when you begin to work with more members on a team or your project begins to scale, it is very beneficial for you to start adding descriptions, although optional, to your different components just for continuity, for ease of communication and understanding amongst your team or throughout your project, especially when changes happen or new members begin to be added to the team. So it's just kind of like a best practice for me, at least. So I'm just going to give it the blog post author for the description. They have this thing for preview URLs, so you can start configuring the preview component for your site. We won't need it now. It is a very cool tool, but for right now and really for this project, we won't be using it. So going back to settings, we have our author name and API ID has automatically been created. So this is how we'll access our singular author query data, and a plural API ID has also automatically been generated. So when you create your names, you really don't want to add, I guess it's called pluralization, or the you don't want to make it a plural because then it will affect the other automatically generated fields. So just keep it singular and everything else will automatically populate for you unless you want to change it to something else. So now we're going to click create model. And once we create our model, we are at our field screen and we want to add fields. And Graph CMS has a number of different fields that you can choose from to add. For this particular model, we will really only need the name field and the asset picker field. The name field will be for the author's name, and the asset picker field will be for a display photo or kind of a avatar for the author. So let's go ahead and add our single line text for the name field. We're going to give it the display name of name, um, and then a description of the author's name. We won't we won't be using any of these field options, so we can scooch on to the next tab. For validation, I will make this field required. I will also set this field as unique. I only want one author in the system. I don't one author with that name in the system. I don't want multiple authors to be able to use the same name. We don't really want to have a limit character count, or at least I don't want to at this time. No specific pattern match, which is usually good for email and URL, and we're not restricting any patterns as well. Advanced, we don't need to change anything here for this project. This is fine. And now we're just going to click create. Okay, so now we are going to pretty much do the same thing with asset picker. And I'm going to name this uh, avatar. That's a good one. All right. And the author's photo. I don't want to allow multiple assets, one author, one picture. Validation, I don't want to make it required. It's nice to have, but not a must have for this project. Advanced, we don't need to change anything here at this point, so we're going to click create. All right, so at this point, we have our author model set and complete. So now we are going to move on to our blog post model. And this one, I'm going to just call it post or post, and everything else will populate. And the description will be blog post. And again, nothing here at this point for preview URLs. That was pretty quick, so I'll show you again. There we go. And then create model. All right. So for the blog post model, we're going to need a couple more fields, which the first will be a single line text field, which will be required for the title. We'll also need a slug field for the URL, and it's also what we're going to use as a way to query our post data. We are going to need the asset picker because we're going to require a cover photo. And then we are also going to need the rich text editor, which again will be required because that is how we're going to add our content. So that would be for the content field. Blog posts need content. So let's get started with the single line text. We are going to give it the display name of title. The title of the blog post will be the description. We are gonna click the field option use as title field, displays the field's value instead of the ID. So Graph CMS for this will generate a random ID number for content, and we don't want that just because those numbers are, you know, ridiculous, which I get why they're ridiculous, but we want something a little bit easier to identify our post with, which is the title. So we're going to use that ID field as, or the title as the ID field. Um, in validations, we are going to make the field required, and we are going to set it as unique. One post, one title. We won't have any limits on the characters, no pattern matches, no restrictions. Advanced, we are fine with this, and we're going to click create. Now is slug, and we're just going to call it slug. And the slug for the blog post. We do want to generate slug from a template. So our slug will be our title field. So whenever we go to the what is this? The address bar, it will be our site slash whatever the post name is instead of our site slash that system generated ID, which is good for SEO, and it's also just good for people trying to find your content a little bit more easily than trying to copy and paste a user generated ID or something crazy like that. So we're gonna do it like that, where we use the title as our slug template. Um, Next, validation, we will make this required. It was already set as unique, so one post, one slug. No post can have the same slug. No two posts can have the same slug. And then the specific pattern match was already automatically populated and generated, which is good for us. We don't have anything to do in the advanced tab, so we're going to click create. All right, and next is the cover photo, which will be using the picker. I'm gonna just name it cover photo using camel case. Blog post cover photo. We do not want to allow multiple assets, one cover photo for each blog post. I do want to make it required for my personal preference and for this project. Advanced, we don't have anything to change here. And we're going to click create. And our last component or our last field will be the text editor. So this, I'm just going to just name content, blog post, content. We are not going to use any of these options. For validation, we will make required because in order to have a blog post, you need content. Advanced, we aren't going to change anything here. So we are done with that field. Okay, so at this point, we are done for the most part setting up our author and post schema. Now, there is one thing we need to do, which is relate these two models, and that's what we're going to do with the reference field. So it's going to create a content relationship. So the first thing we have to do is to define our relationship. And in this case, we want to allow only one model to be referenced. So this will be our, since we are in our post, we are going to go to author, or yeah, we want the author to be referenced. And then we're going to click a, or create a two-way reference. And then we're going to allow multiple blog posts per author. So one author can have multiple blog posts within our content. So the one, we need the many to one. Yes. Okay. So usually I do it the other way around where I do this reference from the author model, but we did it from the post model. So it's a little flip for me. But we're going to do the many to one. So many posts per author. So one author can have many posts. And that's the relationship we want to have. The two-way reference means that from either side, whether it be author or post, which you'll see soon, um, this relationship or this reference can be referenced. You'll see it once we get into creating dummy content. So let's continue. And then here, the configuration reference, we have the display of author. We're just going to put in post author, post or posts, since we can have many posts, author. And we're going to continue. For the reverse configuration for posts, we are going to have blog posts. And we're going to create. So now our author model and our post model have a relationship together. So we're in our post field at this point and we see author. When we go to author, we should see post as well. And again, I will show you also how that works when creating content. But before we do that, we are going to move on to creating a model for our projects. So we're just going to click add model. We're going to name it projects or project. And we're going to give it the description of developers projects. And we're going to create model. And for this model, we're going to need a field for title, which we'll use the single line text. We are going to need asset picker to have an image for our project. We're going to need slug for our project URL. We're going to need the multi-line text description for our description portion to describe more about our project, whether it's an API, a web app, a mobile app, etc. And then we're also going to need two more single line text as a way to have a field for our source URL. So let's say we're housing our project on GitHub, that field will hold our GitHub link. And then also another one to hold our external link for our demo site. So let's say you have a published site or you want to share a link to the actual API, then that will be the field for that. So let's start with our single line text for the project title, and we're going to give it I guess we can call it title again. It shouldn't cause any issues. And we're going to give the description of project title, and we are going to use it as a title field. Validations, it will be required and it should be unique, and we're going to create. For the Project image, we're going to use asset picture and call it project image. And this is a thumbnail representing the project. So let's say you have a logo or something like that. This would be the perfect spot to add that content. Validation, we are gonna make it required, and we're pretty much done here for that one. For slug, we are going to use the slug field. We're gonna name it slug. The API ID will be slug, and this is the project slug. And then we're going to generate slug from a template, and it's going to be title as well for this field. Validation, it will be set as required, and we are going, everything else has been set up for us. So we're going to click create. For description, we are going to use the multi-line text, and I'm gonna just call it description. The projects, keep it simple. Projects description. Let's do IE, app, API, etc., just to help out those who need it. And we're gonna make this field required as well. All right. And our second to last is for the source URL. So I'm going to name it source URL. Source URL for project. And then I'm also going to add a note. Remember to add the HTTP S or protocol for this. If you do not add this for your link, for your external link, it will not work when you render it in your portfolio. So it will send it back to you, or it'll return a 404 page, and because it thinks that it's just another page instead of actually sending you out to an external link. So you need um the full external site address, including the protocol, in order for it to work. So for validation, I only because sometimes you don't have it or you don't want to, I won't set it as make required. I think it should be usually everybody has a GitHub or some type of project, but maybe it's in progress, so you may not have the source code for it or whatnot. And this is the same thing for demo. So I'm not gonna make it required, and I'm just gonna create. And lastly, we are going to set up our demo URL, and we're going to call it demo URL. The published or public site for our project. Again, remember to add HTTP, HTTPS, whichever one it is, make sure you add it. And we're going to click create. All right, so we have our models, which this is all we need. We needed author, we needed post, we needed project. And if we go back to our main dashboard, the next step is to create content. So now we are going to create some dummy content for all of our models. And then after that, we're going to make our API accessible, play around with the playground a little bit just to show you how you can query data, and then we'll move on to our next step. So first, let's create our dummy content. So we are going to start with author. As we can see, we come to another dashboard screen for each of our models, and as we expected, there should not be anything in there, but we are now going to add items. So let's create an author. I'm going to also, if you notice, there are little helpers. That's what comes from putting in descriptions. And that's why it's important to get in a habit of doing it, because it helps people coming in to the project understand what all these fields are for and what they do. I digress. So I'm gonna add my name as the author, Serena Elise. We're going to add a photo. We don't have an existing photo, but we're gonna add one to the project by clicking that. So as you can see, nothing is there, but we're gonna upload something, and I'm going to upload it from my device. Oh, select a file. Um, let's find a picture of moi to add. And again, please find a picture of yourself or whatever you want to put, a caricature, a picture, and I probably slaughtered that word. A picture, a avatar, it does not matter. And I'm going to just use this photo. Does anybody else find it weird when they see like images of themselves? Anyways, and then you can also change the look of it. You can crop it, you can circle it. I actually kind of want to make it a little circle. You can rotate it. You have some ability to alter the photo, not a lot, but a good amount. And you click save. And I'm going to upload. So you see that the photo is now in draft mode. So any assets that you add to the platform or to your project is going to have to be published just like any other piece of content. So once we go ahead and once we get to the point where we're saving and publishing, we will get prompted to also confirm that we want to save and publish our assets as well. So we've got our name, we've got our photo, and now we have this blog or this post section. So this is where that two-way relationship comes in. So if I wanted to and I did not want to leave this screen or this view, I could start adding blog posts from here instead of going into another view. Um, I am going to go into the other view just to show you what it looks like, but that is what that relationship or that reference builder does for the at least the content aspect. You're able to create either a post from the author screen or an author from the post screen. But we're not going to do that right now. So we are good to just save and publish. And as I said, you are also prompted to confirm that you want to publish your asset as well. And I do. So now we can save and publish. And if we go back to our author content dashboard area, we now have an author that we can edit, that we see is published. We have that generated ID that I was talking about. Right now, post is empty because we haven't created any posts under this author. But we also get some other system generated information like created at, created by, updated, etc. So now let's create some post content. So again, we have nothing here and we're gonna click create item. We're gonna give our first blog post the title of new blog post. And as you see, the slug for the new blog post is automatically generated, which is what we want. We want it to have been populated from our title. We're going to add a cover photo. Right now, the only asset I have is a photo of me, so I'm going to upload another photo. And I will probably just be reusing this photo over and over again for each piece of the dummy content. And I really like this one and I can really resonate with this, so I'm going to click that one and I'm going to upload. Okay, so now we have our title, we have our slug, we have our cover photo. Now we need to add post content. So I don't want to think about anything, so I will use one of these Ipsum generators. I like the Cupcake Ipsum. I'm a foodie. Um, so yeah, I don't have any other explanation except for that. I actually don't want it to be that long. Ooh, that's 5 paragraphs. Good. And generate something a little light. So I'm gonna copy this. I didn't trust that click, so I'm gonna highlight and copy. And I'm going to paste here. But I'm also going to add a couple of other components because down the line in the tutorial, when we get to styling, we are going to want to see how we can use different styling tools. So I'm going to add a header. So let's say I'm just going to call it header 1. I'm going to change it from normal text to header text 1. I'm going to change this to header 2. I'm going to also add um, a bulleted list here. I didn't want that. Um, Let me item 1, item 2, item 3. And make it a bulleted list. And again, you'll see why later in the tutorial why I'm doing this. It'll help us when we begin to start styling our content to see what all we can do with Tailwind CSS and Next.js. So also in the content, you can, of course, there are ways to style. You can click different heading looks. You can add links, quotes, code blocks, other assets. So you want to add images to it, the different types of bullets, more code block or different. This is the actual code block. This is if you just want to add it pieces of code. You can add an iframe for like a GIF. Is that how you pronounce that? GIF. We're gonna go with GIF. You can also add CSS classes to different components if you really wanted to. And you can also add a table. So it's a pretty good rich text format or formatter, and it'll work. I'm actually going to copy this because I will just be doing a lot of copying and pasting after this. So we're done with that. And now we have author. And again, this is where if we wanted to add an existing author, which this time we will, I want to add myself or the author I created to this post. And then we're actually done with this. So we can save and publish. We're going to confirm we want to save and publish the image as well. And we have our first blog post. So we're going to go back and now we have a blog post. What we're going to do to kind of save us a little bit of time is they have this great option of duplicating. So we're going to duplicate the post. Now, we cannot keep any of these because we will run into an error. So let's see what happens. There we go. The title is not unique, which is one of the first required and unique components. Even if I change this, we will still get an error for the slug because the slug is not unique. So what I'm going to do now is I have what is this? A Chrome extension that will fill in all inputs with dummy data, and it's what is this called? It is called Fake Filler, which I absolutely love using. And I use this when I am creating forms and I want to test the function of the form out. But it also works here to just generate dummy content really quickly. So we already have a title. This is not what we wanted. So in order to correct that, we just need to click regenerate. And now it will give us the slug we need. Here, I'm going to clear and I'm going to uh-oh, that didn't work. Oh, there it is. And I'm going to copy and paste that post content from the last post. And I'm going to do this maybe like 2 or 3 more times. So you'll just see me going through the same process of creating dummy content for our Graph CMS project. Okay, duplicate, regenerate, clear, paste. Okay, I think we're good to go here. Save and publish. All right. And then we're going to duplicate. We're going to use our fake filler, regenerate, clear. I'm not sure why it does this. I don't know if something's going on this time, but and whenever I used to click clear, it didn't remove the box and I didn't have to make it full screen, but for whatever reason this time is opting to do it. Maybe next time when I go into Graph CMS it won't. All right, last one. I'm gonna duplicate. We're gonna fake fill, regenerate, clear. Oh, and if you haven't understood what I was doing, this just makes everything full screen. This little box here, it enters into full screen. And I think we are good to go. So we can save and publish. All right. So if we go back to our main screen for our post, we have five, one, two, three, four, five. Yes, five posts. And they have their slugs, they have their titles. We have the author connected to each post. This one is in draft and it should not be. So we are just going to change that to publish and we're going to publish it. So now we have all five posts published and we're going to move on to project. And project is pretty much very similar to how we did the other two. So I am just going to create an item, new project, add an image. Let's just give it a new image. We'll do that. I think that's pretty cool. Give it a description. Just call it web app. All right. And for the source URL, I'm going to use my personal portfolio URL for both. Again, you would use your actual source URL or your demo URL, but feel free to go to serenalise.com if you want to check out more portfolio. Shameless plug. And we're going to save and publish. We're going to okay our asset. And pretty much we're going to do the same thing. Duplicate a couple times with the fake filler. And generate. Let me clear this. Oops. All right. Save and publish. Let's do it another 2 more times. Okay, so if we go back, we now have 4 published projects with our demo URLs, our source URLs, our titles, our slug, our project image, everything we need. So now let's go back to our quick start. We set up our schema, we created content. Now let's kind of just play around and explore our content using the API playground, which is pretty cool. So I've tried to understand GraphQL a couple different times, and I did not understand it until I actually used it. And using this playground helped me tremendously. So, for anyone who is trying to figure out or learn GraphQL, this is a great way to learn by doing. I cannot explain to you exactly how GraphQL works yet, but if you want to learn by doing, this is great. So they have this Explorer tab, which will you can change if you want to query. You can also change if you're trying to mutate. We're not trying to change or add content, so we're going to stick with query. And throughout this project, we're just querying data. We're not changing or adding, aka mutating anything. So we have some system generated fields that we can query from, and we also have the ones that we query. And we have the singular version, so it retrieves a single author. We have the plural version. We have the single post. We have the plural. This is why those system generated API IDs were created. So let's say you want to query an author. You can click on author and it will help you set up your query syntax or the GraphQL syntax to use in order to query those authors. You can click it again, it will clear all of that out. Let's say we want to just query all the authors in the system. This is pretty much all the syntax you need for the playground. You click go, it will query the authors for the system. We only have, excuse me, for the project, we only have one, so only one ID is going to be generated, and ID is the default query. Let's say we want to query the names of those authors in your project. Click go, and now you see how the GraphQL queries are set up and their syntax, and this will help you kind of better understand how to query and mutate with GraphQL. So, and pretty much what we're going to do here, I've kind of understood how to get the syntax together. But again, if you still don't understand that well, you can use this as a shortcut to get the queries we're going to need just to copy and paste and put it into our Next.js project later. And that's honestly what I do. I start here in the playground, test out the query to make sure it's returning what I want. Once it's good, I copy and paste it, stick it into Next.js. It makes it a whole lot easier. So hopefully you find this extremely helpful as far as one, querying your actual data. It makes it a lot quicker and a lot easier. And also two, as a way to start to learn GraphQL and how to use that tool. All right. So if we go back, we've played around with the API to see how we can fetch content. Now we need to make our API accessible. So first thing we see is our endpoints, which we will use in Next.js. So we will definitely be coming back to reference this page. Gonna click remind me later. And for this project, we're just gonna use the public content API. For personal projects, more robust projects, things you want to keep more secure, you will use the permanent author token, and you will get the bearer token and use the .env files and all that good stuff. But for this one, we are just going to use public content API, and we need to just start by creating our permissions. So it says, would you like us to initialize some defaults? And the defaults that would be allowed would be read on all models, on stage, published for all locales. And yes, that's pretty much all we want. We just want to be able to read the data. We're not trying to change it. We're not trying to remove it. None of that. We just want to be able to query and read it. So we're going to click yes to initialize defaults. And now we have our permissions that we can go ahead and use when we want to query data. So that's pretty much all we needed to do for API access for a public content API. Permanent author or permanent auth tokens. It's a couple more steps, but we're not using that. So right now we are good to go. We have set up our Graph CMS project. So from this, let's go back to our main screen. We learn how to set up our schemas. We learn how to create content. We learn how to explore our content, and we learn how to also make our API accessible. So the next thing we'll do is set up Next.js so we can move on to the next step of integrating our content with our front end. So let's do that now. Okay, so now that we are finished setting up Graph CMS, we are going to set up Next.js, and we're going to use Next.js documentation to get us started. So when we go to our Next.js docs and specifically the getting started page, we see that one, we're recommended to use our learning course or their learning course, which I do recommend doing. It definitely gives you a good, it helps facilitate the understanding of how to use Next.js. I did it. It's pretty quick, very simplistic in the terms of understanding, so it's not a whole bunch of jargon. I think you could probably get it done in a weekend, maybe even a day if you have that type of time, or just a couple of hours. So I do encourage starting with their Learn course outside of this tutorial. You also want to check and make sure that your computer or your system meets the requirements needed in order to use Next.js. And as far as setup, we're pretty much just using the steps that they gave us. Not even pretty much. We're using the steps they gave us for automatic setup. This way, we don't have to manually set up all three dependencies: Next, React, and React DOM. So let's go ahead and get started with that. First, we are going to create a folder in a location of choosing. I'm choosing my desktop. I'm going to call it Next.js, and I'm going to open it in my code editor, which I'm using VS Code. And this is a shortcut to open VS Code from your root project folder. We're not gonna update right now, so I'm gonna just click later. And now that we are in our project in VS Code, we're gonna toggle to open up a terminal within the view. One thing I like to do is split my terminal into two terminals, one for when I start the local host or the local environment so that I can see all the errors and messages and all that good stuff in the left. And then on the right is where, let's say I need to add another dependency or I need to save to Git. That's what the right is for. So it just keeps it a little bit more organized. So now that we are in our project in our code editor, we are just going to use the commands that they give us for automatic setup, which in this case, I'm going to use Yarn. It is your choice of what you want to use, whether Yarn or NPX. Yarn for me will be used throughout the project and you should keep it consistent as well. So Yarn, create, next app, and I'm going to give it the name of portfolio and hit enter, and it should begin installing all necessary dependencies. And you see that it does tell us the status, and it says installing those dependencies we talked about: Next, React, and React DOM. Okay, so now that our project portfolio or project folder has successfully been created, we can change directory into that folder and start our development environment with Yarn Dev. So we're going to cd or change directory into the portfolio folder, and then we are going to Yarn Dev. So now our local host server is running at the URL localhost 3000. So I'm just going to command click to open it up. And when you go to localhost 3000, this is the page you should see. This is the default welcome page for Next.js. And once you see this, this is good. This means that everything is running as it should. So now that we have our Next.js set up, we're going to kind of structure our folder a little bit. At this point, if you're using Git or GitHub, this would be a good time to set that up. I won't go over how to set that up in this tutorial because it's out of the scope. We want to focus on Next.js, Graph CMS, and Tailwind CSS. However, like I said, this will be a good point to set that portion of it up if you're using that. So if we go back into our code editor, we also see that there was some type of change in the next configuration JS file, which I'll show you in a second. Not the change, but I'll show you the file. And we need to restart the server to see the effects. So I'm going to stop the server and then pretty much just restart it. Okay, so when we open our portfolio, it'll cascade. We will see now that we have our our next folder, we have the node modules folder, we have our pages folder, which also has some default content in it. We have our public folder, which holds our assets, so images for the most part. And then we have our styles folder, which holds our styles modules or our styles file, CSS files. We also have our lint file, our get ignore file, a next config JS file, a package JSON, README, and a yarn lock, which is what we expect to have in our structure. So let's do a couple things because there's a lot in here we don't need for this project. And let's start with pages. So one of the things we don't need is the API folder. For this project, we don't need it, so we're going to delete it. In the index file, we don't need any of these imports at the moment. So we're going to delete those imports, and we are also going to delete this content because we're going to completely give it an overhaul. But we are going to put in some dummy content just to make sure it is working. So when we save it, we should see over here in the browser the change being made. So save it, and automatically we see the change. That's what we want to see. In our public folder, we are going to delete the Vercel SVG. Don't need it. We are also going to delete the home module CSS folder. So let's delete that one as well. Yes, move to trash. We're keeping the global CSS because we are going to pretty much set that up with Tailwind CSS settings. So we're going to keep it for now. And that is all we needed to change. So far we've set up Graph CMS, we set up Next.js, and we've structured our Next.js um, project folder. So now what we need to do is install dependencies for styling and GraphQL. Okay, so now we are going to move on to installing dependencies for styling and GraphQL. So first, we're going to install Tailwind CSS, which is a CSS framework for UI and styling. In the past, I use or have used Material UI, but I decided to try something different, learn something new. That's pretty popular, and I will say it was a little bit of a learning curve, and I'm still not quite sure how I feel about it, but I've gotten better at using it, so I'm starting to like it a little bit more. But you can definitely be the judge. You can actually skip this part as far as the CSS framework if you're choosing to use something else. But if you want to rock along with the tutorial and just use Tailwind CSS or understand the basics of Tailwind CSS, keep watching. So we first want to install Tailwind CSS and its peer dependencies, and then we're going to generate our Tailwind config file as well as our post config file. And where we're going to know how to do that is to go to Tailwind CSS documentation. So the great thing about Tailwind CSS is not only does it have just general generic documentation, which is here just to get us started. They also have documentation geared towards your specific framework, which we're using Next.js. So we've already created our project. So now we need to, again, install Tailwind CSS and its peer dependencies, as well as initiate or generate the Tailwind config file and the post CSS config file. So we will do that now in our code editor, or I'll do it in my code editor in the terminal, and you can do it in, if you're using VS Code, the same way, or maybe you have to do it in a separate terminal. Personally, I'm again going to be consistent and use Yarn. So instead of npm install, I'm going to use Yarn add the Tailwind CSS, and it's gonna show an error, and I'm gonna let the error show once I try to put this in. Fixer. Up. And this is a problem. So what it did was it installed this in the wrong folder. We were not in the portfolio folder. So it installed our Tailwind CSS information in our root folder instead of in our actual project folder. So what I'm going to do is just delete all of this. Delete. Yep. Delete. Delete. I'm actually surprised that it even installed in the root folder. Usually I get a nice error, but it didn't this time. So now what we need to do is to change directory into portfolio. Okay. And now we need to install those same things in the portfolio folder, not our root directory folder. All right, so now we see that the yarn lock in our portfolio folder has changed. We see that our package JSON has changed because we should see our Tailwind dependencies here, which is what we want. Okay, so now we have installed our Tailwind CSS and its dependencies. We also need to initiate those two files, the config file and the post CSS config file. So that is going to happen with the command yarn Tailwind CSS init p. And if we look at our file structure, we should now see a post CSS configuration file, and we should also see a Tailwind configuration file, which is what we want. Cool. So now that we have installed Tailwind CSS for our styling, we need to install GraphQL and GraphQL requests for querying our data. And if I'm not mistaken, when we go to GraphQL, we'll go back to our home page and then we will see how to integrate your content with your front end. And Next.js is the first one. Again, another platform that specifically tailors to specific frameworks, which I love. And that is the first thing we need to do in order to be able to query our data is to install these two dependencies, GraphQL and GraphQL requests. So that is exactly what we're going to do. Yarn add GraphQL, and I spelled it wrong. GraphQL request. Okay, so if we go back to our JSON file, package JSON, we should see those two dependencies have been added. So yes, we see GraphQL and we see GraphQL request. Perfect. So now we are going to take a step back and go back to our Tailwind configuration file. We're also going to go back to our installation or documents page for Next.js. So before we set up the file, one, if you're using VS Code, you should install the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense plugin or extension. Tailwind CSS. And I already have it installed, but this is what it is. So what it does and what it's for is it allows for autocomplete. So intelligent suggestion for class names. It allows for linting, so to highlight errors and bugs within your CSS. Hover previews to see a complete CSS for class names, and syntax highlighting, which provides syntax definitions so you know for Tailwind features and they're highlighted correctly. So I highly, highly, highly recommend adding this extension to your VS Code editor. And now back to what we were originally doing. So we will go back to our documentation and we are setting up our Tailwind configuration file first. And what we need to do, let's get out of that. Let's go back to this. pretty much we just need to copy what's here. So add the paths of all your template files into the tailwind configuration.js file. And I'm going to literally just copy and paste and add that. Actually, I don't want to add that here and save. Oh, we got an extra comma. All right. And we can do this now, since we're already setting up files. In that global CSS file in our styles folder, we're going to remove all of this. And we're actually going to add our tailwind directives to our global CSS folder. And we're gonna save. And later on, we'll start to see, once we start to add Tailwind CSS utilities to our file for stylings, we'll start to see that replicate in our browser. Just a quick look-see of what it'll look like. Let's say we wanted to change the size, weight, and color. We're gonna give it a class name. We're going to do text. um oh, we forgot to save. Oh no, I'm in this folder. um Text 9XL. We're going to say, actually, let's do color. No, text 9. And we will see that the size changed. Let's do font. And now you see, this is what the extension does. It allows us to see the utility list pop up based off of what we start to type, and it gives us the options that will match closely to what we want, or it gives us the options to figure out what we want. I'm gonna make it font weight bold, and we're going to make pink. No, we don't want. Can't remember if it's text pink or color pink. Text. I think it's text pink. Yeah, text pink. Let's do 600, and we're gonna save. So now we see our changes. So these are all Tailwind CSS utility changes happening in the browser that we're putting in our main templates or main files. So that is pretty much it. We can close that out. We fixed that. That is pretty much it. We have installed our dependencies for both styling and querying, which are the Tailwind CSS dependencies as well as the GraphQL dependencies. And then we configured our Tailwind CSS files as well as our global CSS style file. So now that we have that set up, we're going to move on to creating our navbar.js. Okay, so now that we have GraphCMS set up, we have Next.js set up, we also have installed some dependencies for our styling, and also to query GraphCMS using GraphQL, we will start actually building out our site. So the first thing we're going to do is create our navigation bar. And you want to make sure you're actually in your project folder. So for this tutorial, it's called portfolio, and in that folder we're going to create a components folder, and this folder is what is going to hold our UI pieces that we'll be using over and over, like navbar, footer, etc. And those who are familiar with React will understand this concept. So first, let's add a components folder, and then inside of that we're going to add a JS file called navbar. And then once we do that, we're going to import it into our index.js file and then review it or add some test content just to review and make sure it's working correctly in the browser. So first, let's create our new folder called components. Inside the components folder, we're going to add that navbar.js file. And in this file, we're going to build out our functional component for the nav bar. So export default. Let's save. So let's go to our index.js file in the pages folder. We're going to import navbar, and we get a little helper from the components folder. And in here, we're going to take out welcome, and I'm going to put in nav. Okay, I'm gonna hit save, and there we go. The nav bar is working. Let's remove this styling. All right, I actually want to format the document to make it prettier and easier to read. So we're gonna keep the nav bar pretty simple, using divs and on an unordered list. So our nav bar is going to have three right aligned nav bar components for home, portfolio, and blog. Then, and like I said, there are a number of ways to create a nav bar using very simply how we're going to do it, or you can use libraries to make it extra fancy and to add responsiveness. But we're just going to go the simple route for the sake of the tutorial, again using divs and unordered list elements. So first we're going to create a main div that will span the screen view with, and inside of that is going to have two nested divs, and the first div is going to be the one to hold the logo or branding key item, and then the second div is what's going to hold our unordered list and list elements. So let's go ahead and do that. So back in our, we can close this out for now. Back in our navbar.js file, let's take this out. And so we already have our parent div, so let's go ahead and add those nested divs. So the first, again, is for the logo or branding area. And then the second will be for the unordered list for our menu items. I'm gonna just copy. Okay, so let's go ahead and say that. And next, what we want to do is turn the list items into links that will route to the associated page when we click it. So first, in order to have that happen, we have to add the Next.js link import. So let's import link from next slash oops slash link. Okay. And now what we have to do is, within a list components or for each list item, we're going to add the link tag inside of it or nested within it, as well as the required href attribute for each of those. So the href attribute is what you want the name for the page to be. So when we begin to add pages to our directory, that href name has to match that page name as well. And we're going to keep it simple. So the page name, the two page names we need to add, because home will just be a backslash, it'll go to that home main page. The other two will be named projects, and well, one is will be named projects and the other will be named blog. And what we're going to see is once we add those links, right now they won't work because we don't have the pages added. So we'll end up seeing a 404 screen, but we can see whether or not the links are working by either looking at the the address bar, or even hovering over the link inside of the navigation bar once we start to see the content on the page. So let's first go ahead and add that link component to our list items. So, oops, LNK, that href. This is going to be for the home page. So we just need to add that backslash. And you do need to add an anchor tag as well um, around the actual text content to make it a clickable link. For the projects, do the same thing. I'm going to go backslash projects for that endpoint. I'm actually going to call this link my work. And I'm gonna save it. And now we see our links listed. And it looks a little funky because we haven't styled it yet. But again, if we hover over it, we see that this just goes to localhost, which is our main page. Work goes to projects. Blog goes to blog. If we click blog, we end up with the 404 error page. This page cannot be found, which makes sense because we have not created the page. So we can go back to the localhost main page, and that is exactly what we wanted to see. Now, we're going to save the bulk of the styling for the end of the tutorial, but we can do a little bit of styling now just because I don't like how this looks right now and it's going to irk me. So when I'm creating the other pieces of content, so let's just do a little bit now. So like I said, we're doing styling with Tailwind CSS, and I want to make the navigation screen width, and I want to set this component with the layout as grid with 2 columns. So in order to do that, in the parent div, we are going to give it some utilities, with the first being W screen for screen width, grid, grid calls 2. So we're creating 2 grid columns. And then I also want to add a little bit of padding. Let's save that for now. So it's split out that those 2 nested divs into 2 separate sections, so you can definitely see the 2. So or you can see the separation between the 2. For the second nested div, we are also going to give it some margin, specifically margin left to push the items to the right. And then what we're going to do is make the unordered list component a grid component with 3 grid columns for each of the menu items. And then we're also going to center the text for the list items. So let's go ahead and do that. So in this one, we're gonna give I want to say the parent div of the list items, margin left auto to push it to the right. Okay, so that's what we wanted. And then for the unordered list items, we're going to give it a couple of utilities, grid, grid calls. Again, we want 3 columns for each of the 3 list items. They do have a utility where it will you can create columns based on how many elements. So the Tailwind CSS will automatically know how many grid items or columns to choose. But for right now, we know it's exactly 3. It's not going to change for this project, and it's fine how it is. So, or fine using grid call 3 for this specific project. Um, but that was a diversion. So let's save this, and that's almost exactly how we want it to look. So another thing I want to do is center the text items. First, before I do any adding of margins or paddings, I think that will separate the navigation item list how I want it. So There we go. So yeah, we separated those so they have some, some equal division between them so it can look like you would want a navigation to look. So with that being said, we are now done with our navigation. So we can move on to styling or creating and styling our home or landing page. Okay, so now that we have a nav bar set up, let's go into our index.js file where we're going to build out our home component. And our home page will consist of, I want to say, four sections. So we're going to have a hero section, an about section, a project section, and a latest article section. So the project section will hold three cards for each project, and the latest article section will show two of our latest blog posts, the title of two of our latest blog posts that we've created, as well as a link to each individual blog post page or their dynamic pages. So now that we are in the index.js folder, we are going to, we're in our main div, we're going to leave the nav bar where it is, and we're going to nest another div into this section or this parent div. Inside that, we're going to nest four more divs for those different sections of the page. And I'm just going to copy and paste. 2, 3, 4. Okay, I'm going to save it. So, like I said, the first section will be our hero section, and we're going to do a little bit of styling here too, just so we can see how our components lay out on the page. So for the hero section, what we're going to do is set it to a grid layout with two columns, and then we're going to align the items in the center of the divs and give it some height so that we can make it a little bit bigger like you see other hero sections on other websites. So first, we are going to give the hero section some utilities. Grid is a layout. Grid 2, item center, and height. Yeah. Okay. So inside of that, we're going to nest two divs. That's all we gave it, the layout of grid with two columns. So the first div is going to hold our, I want to say just like our introduction. So, hi, my name is XYZ. So, hey, I'm Serena. And then the next div is where we're going to put like a quick blurb about ourselves. Um, so that would be like, hey, I'm a front end developer from Atlanta, Georgia, who specializes in XYZ. And we're going to give or make that a paragraph component. Just, something short and sweet. I'm going to copy and paste what I had written out in a different document here. You can put whatever you like. I use part of the that cupcake is some generator as well. Now I'm going to format the document to make it prettier. So I'm going to save, and we should see our content. So we see we have those two grid columns with the intro side and then also our little elevator speech side. And okay. So now that we have done that, we need to create our about section, and it's going to be a lot of these divs, if not all of them, are going to be structured pretty much the same way, where we have the first div with the I want to say header, and then a second div nested within it with a paragraph or something like that. Or at least these first two sections are pretty much laid out the exact same. So I'm just going to copy and paste. And this is going to get changed to, actually, let's format this to make it easier to read. We see we have some space added that we did not want from the copy and paste, so be careful with that. Change that to about. I'm going to change that paragraph content just to differentiate. Format again and save. So now we have our about section. So the next section is going to be our project section. So again, it's going to be set up the same way. And I'm going to just copy and paste. Oops. Let me grab this. So I'm going to copy and paste into that section div format a little bit. And what we're going to do is change the header to say projects. And right now we are just going to do a placeholder to say list of project cards go here. And I'm doing that because I'll show you how to set up those cards when showing you how to query the content that will go into the cards. But for now, we just want to put a placeholder so we see where all of our content will go. And now lastly, our last div will show our latest blog post or the title of our latest 2 blog posts. And I'm just going to copy and paste the project section because we're also going to just put a placeholder there as well. We're going to name this section or give it the title of latest articles and list of blog posts go here. Okay. And I think I may have an extra div that I didn't actually need. So let's save. Nope. Control Z. Let's format and see what's going on with that. We have some extra space. Okay, no, we just needed to format. Okay, so that is the structure of our homepage. Not pretty yet, but it allows us to see where content is going to be laid out. We'll add some spacing, we'll add some color, we'll add that generated content from Graph CMS and make it more visually appealing later on in the tutorial. But for now, this is exactly what we want. So next, we're going to go to creating our main blog page. Okay, so now that we have created our navigation bar and nav bar component, as well as built out our home page or our landing page inside of the index.js file, we are going to create the main page for our blog, as well as for our projects page. So that'll be kind of like our blog landing page. So the main page or landing page will have a hero section with a list of 5 posts that we've generated. So what we're going to do in the pages folder is create a blog.js file. All right. So whenever you create a page in the page directory or that page folder, an associated route is created based on that file name. So for us to get to that blog page, it needs to be the same name as the name we gave or the path endpoint we gave when we were creating our navigation components or our nav list items. So that's why we're naming it blog.js. So let's add some test content, and check it in a browser to make sure that it is working when we click our blog link in the navigation bar. So let's do export default function. I'm going to create a functional component, just call it blog. Return blog main. Save it, and when we go into the browser and click blog, we should see our content. We should no longer see that 404 page. So now that we have that working, what we're going to do is just delete that, and we're going to add that navbar component. We also need to import it. We should have imported it before, but that's okay. Navbar from our components folder. And let's just save here to make sure it's working. Okay, so now we see our navigation bar. So inside of, let's make this pretty. Under our navigation bar, we're gonna nest another div. Um, Actually, we're gonna nest two divs. One to hold the blog header, which will be our hero section, and then the other to hold where we're gonna actually generate the list content for our blog post. For right now, we are going to just put a placeholder until we get to the point where we're actually generating content for these pages. So we're gonna do div h2 blog. And then we're going to have that second div for our list of blog posts go here. And we're going to save. And this is what we want. So once we add styling, we'll end up duplicating this for our main page for our projects. But for now, we'll move on to setting up the page layout for our dynamic posts or our single post and single projects page. So in order to create dynamic posts, or excuse me, dynamic pages for our single post and projects, we are first going to start by creating two folders in our pages directory, one for projects and one for pages. So let's create that first folder for post. This is going to be where we hold our dynamic pages or dynamic page content for posts, and then inside of pages, project. So inside of both folders, what we want to do is add a file called slug.js, but it's also going to have some brackets around the word slug, which indicates to Next.js that this is a dynamic page. So this is how we create pages with dynamic routes, meaning that pages can be created dynamically based on an individual project or post slug that we retrieve from GraphCMS. But for now, we're just going to add placeholders again to both pages until we begin to generate and display data. So first let's create that bracket slug bracket.js file for this one, and the same thing for project bracket slug bracket.js. And again, what we're going to do is just put in some dummy content. Actually, I am going to copy and paste because I don't want to have to type everything out for both of these. I'm going to save. Here, dynamic post content. Function, I'm going to call it post. Let me make sure this is specific to post. I'm going to actually copy and paste again. Project. Anywhere I see post, replace with project. Okay. So now if we want to test our endpoint, we can go to our site, create some type of arbitrary endpoint path, and what we should see is this content showing up. So we're going to do it with posts. So the first part of the path is going to be that post folder. So pages, then post is that next part of the path. And then after that, we're just going to make up a random slug name that doesn't exist, but it's just to point to a dynamic page so we can make sure that it's working. And I'm just going to type in test module. Oh, that's because the path is different. I think another dot will do that. Another level. Okay. Maybe Let's do this. Da-da. Components slash navbar. Let's refresh. There we go. So now we see that any value we put here will lead to this same page for now because we're not generating any dynamic content yet. But once we begin to add those queries and generate that content, it will show the content for that specific post for that specific slug that we will query from GraphCMS. And the same thing for projects. So let's go to, let me open post back up, copy that because we will get the same error. And let's test this out. Change project because project is the folder which then becomes part of the pathway. And now we see dynamic project content. So the pages are working and it's pulling as it should. Now we can actually move on to generating our data for our pages. Okay, it is time to finally generate content to add to the pages that we just composed for our site. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the GraphCMS documentation to guide us on how we're going to request data or query data from GraphCMS for our Next.js project. So we've already installed our dependencies. So the next step we're going to do is to create a new GraphQL client, the point star endpoint, which GraphQL or GraphCMS will already have in the documentation your project's endpoint in this code box or code block that you can copy. Yours may be different. It not only has the public version, but it also has how to set up if you're using the permanent auth token version of it, which is really good. You don't have to think about it. And then once we have those components set up, it gives you step-by-step instructions on how to set up your sending your first query, and then how to actually work with your query to generate the content how you want it to look. Just an example. So we are, like I said, we already installed our dependencies. So the next thing is to create that new GraphQL client. But before we do that, we also need to import some libraries or some components in order for this to work. So in the blog.js file, we are going to import the GraphQL client from GraphQL request, but we're also going to import that GQL function as well since we're going to need it down the line. That way, it just condenses some of the typing. And we're going to GraphQL request. Okay. And in addition to that, because we're going to have links, the titles for all of the blog posts in the list are going to link to their dynamic page, and so we want to import the link component from next link. We also want to import next image component because we're going to have cover photos and thumbnail photos. So let's do that. So that's that one. Then also let's import image from next image. Okay. So now, based on the steps outlined for us from GraphCMS, we need to set up that endpoint as a new variable GraphCMS for that client. So I'm really just going to copy and paste here. Okay. And now that we have done that, we can set up our query. and send our query so we can generate content from it. So first, let's go to the API playground. Earlier in the tutorial, I told you I like to start here to kind of test out my queries before adding them into my project. So with this, we want to query a list of all the blog posts and a couple of other items within that, including the title, the cover photo, and the slug. So I'm actually going to delete all of this. So one way to do it is to start with the Explorer like we showed. And since we want to query multiple or retrieve multiple blog posts, I'm going to start with that. So let's just click play. And now we have a list of the IDs for all of our blog posts. So yes, ID is one of the other fields that we want to query for. In addition to that, we also want to query for slug. We also want to query for a title. And I think we also want to query cover photo. And in addition to just having cover photo, we also need to get the URL for that cover photo. And let's play with that. And now we have all the information we need for our list of blog posts on our main page. So, like I said, all we're going to do is copy and paste the content from here in the playground into Next.js. So let's go back to first. Let me copy posts, this one, and let's go back to the framework guide. So to send our first query, we've already imported the GQL function. What we need to do is create a variable const query. And this is where we're going to use that GQL with the template literals. And this is where we are going to paste that query markup from the playground here. So let's format the documentation to make it look nicer and easier to read. Okay. So in addition to that, we need to use get static props in order to actually, so we set up our endpoint that we are pulling from. We set up our query variable with our actual structure for what we want to pull from GraphCMS. So now we actually need to set up the function that will allow us to fetch that content and post it based on a query. And that's where the get static props function comes into play. So what we want to do, we can actually just copy and paste that because the plural for post is the exact same of what we called it. We didn't call it anything different. So that's really what we're going to do, save some typing and copy and paste. Now if your model or your fields were called something different, you will obviously have to change it to fit with what you have or what you've created in GraphCMS. But for us, it's the same. So we create that async await function with get static props. We create that post variable. This is our query request. And we return our props as posts. And then we can go ahead and save. I like to save after every point. um, so yeah, that is good right there. Now we can begin to work with our query results. And this is how we're going to actually see if what we took from GraphCMS and put into Next.js is actually working. So we created a placeholder. So the first thing we need to do in order to start using our query results is to add post as a parameter into our function. So post is now there. So we can now start using our query results inside of this function. So how this is going to be set up is we're going to set up we have that second div with our list of posts, and it's going to be a 2-column grid format where the key for the div is the ID to give a unique identity to every element. It is also required So you need a key. And then the first column is going to have the cover photo, and the second column is what's going to hold the title as a link to the individual or dynamic post page. And for this, we need to use the conditional rendering as well as the map method. So it's going to be very similar to this example, just a couple of little different nuances. So let's get started building out our list and pulling data for our list of blog posts. So like I said, we're going to conditionally render our blog posts. We're going to start with post.map, just like the example. We are going to list the items that we want to be able to use from our query, which is pretty much all of them. And I think it what's it called? Cover photo. Okay. So now what we want to do is continue. Make sure we get that right. Okay. All right. So let me format the text a little bit. Okay. So we're going to create that parent div. And for that, we need, again, that required key parameter. And the ID will be the key for us this time. Okay, there is something off. All right, maybe not. We'll see. If we get an error, we can fix it. Then inside of that div is where we're going to split it into two. So the first div is going to hold our image. All right, and for this we need source equals cover photo URL. So this is why we needed to not only just query cover photo, but query the URL, because a source URL is required for this image component. We're gonna give it a alt text, blog post cover image. We are also gonna give it a width of just 150 and a height of 150 as well. Okay. And let's format this a little bit. Okay, so we can see it a little bit easier. So that's the first div where it's going to hold our image component. This next div is where we are going to have the actual blog post title. So we're going to give it an H2 element, or give the title render the title as an H2 element. But it will also have that link component added because we wanted to be able to direct to the dynamic page for the blog post, for the specific or singular blog post. So again, we need that required href, and inside of here we are going to use template literals. So we're going to have it direct to the post path, or that's where that post folder that we created that holds our dynamic post. And then we are also going to add this slug as that variable that will be populated there. And inside of that, we will have our A tags, our anchor tags, and we will have the title populated. So we can save that. All right. So let's go to the main blog page. We end up with this error in the browser. So if we go to this page, it'll give us a little bit more information on what's going on, and it's pretty much an unconfigured host. So all we have to do in our next.config.js file is add a domain that we want to configure with our project for our images. So we can go back. We still have the error. We're going to go to next .config.js, and in here we are going to add that um, that parameter. So instead of assets.example, we need to add media.graphcms.com. So let's just copy and paste this, images, and let's change to the GraphCMS host. I'm gonna save. Now, in order for us to see what's going on, we have to restart the server. So let's stop the server, Control C, and then um, I'm actually gonna refresh and yarn dev. Cool. So now we see our list of blog posts. And no, it's not the prettiest yet, but this is exactly what we, not exactly what we wanted to see. This is what we wanted to see as far as the list of cover photos as well as the post titles. And if we hover over it, they are clickable links. So it will go to, once we get our dynamic content loaded or our query started, it will lead to those individual blog post pages. Again, we will be doing configuration as far as styling later on in the tutorial towards the end, but for now, this will do. All right, so now after this, what we're pretty much gonna do is everything we did for the blog homepage, we're going to copy and paste for the project homepage. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's copy all of this. Actually, just start with copying the imports. So copy the imports, go to, we're gonna have to create a new page called projects because that's the path we gave in our, right, that's the path we gave in our navigation. So again, the first thing is we're gonna copy, actually, you know what, we can copy and paste all of it and just swap out anything that says blog post for projects. So we have our imports, we have our what is it? Our endpoint. Now the query needs to be changed because we have posts, so we need projects. But before we just go ahead and swap out terms, let's make sure that if I put in projects, the query is still going to work as expected. So no, it's different because cover photo is not a part of it. So I think it's project image is what we called it. Okay, so in addition to swapping out posts, I need to swap out projects and project image, and we're gonna have to do that everywhere. So let's, anything posts, we're gonna name projects. All right, so projects, 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 projects. Anything cover photo, we are going to name project image or rename it project image. Okay, and then the last thing we need to do is change this function name to project. I'll call it projects and save. So now let's see if we go to the projects page if we get something very similar. Okay, this is exactly what we wanted to see. So now that we have, and let's just check and make sure. Okay, it says that's because we did not change the path. So right now it says dynamic post content, and that's because right now it is still pointing to that post folder. We need it to point to the project folder if we want to um, go to our dynamic content for projects. And I'm actually going to change this to, all right. So if we refresh. Oh, we are still. Let's go back. Let's go. Okay, so now it's saying dynamic project content, and that is what we want. So, excellent. So now we can move on to actually generating content for our individual or dynamic pages. All right, so generating content for each individual blog post or for our dynamic post pages is very similar to how we generated our content and for our project and blog post main page or that landing page. The only difference is we also have to query for the path. So we need to use or add Next.js get static paths function to get the specific path that we want for each individual blog post. So first, let's go to our post slug page and let's start with importing our Graph CMS or excuse me, our GraphQL imports. Okay, so now the next thing we need to do is also add our Graph CMS endpoint. So let me go back to Graph CMS. Um, let's go here, Explorer Guide, copy paste. All right. And now we want to go back to our playground just to practice or test out our query for our individual blog posts. I've already done it here. So, but how you can do it, let me just walk you back through it. Is again, if you're still not comfortable just creating the query syntax on your own, you can use the Explorer tab in that playground left pane. So we want a singular post, so we will click post to retrieve a single post. Um, and then we have to have a conditional clause of where. And for us, we're going to use slug. You can use title, you can use ID, but we're going to use slug. In addition to that, we also, for each individual blog post, we want to query for the author's name. We want to query for the content in an HTML format. We want to query for the project ID, excuse me, the post ID, as well as the post slug. And if we test it out, we should get some content for that specific blog post, and that's exactly what we want. And again, what we're going to do is do a little bit of copy and pasting and adding this into Next.js, but there are a few little steps that we have to do first. So the first thing is, what I do want to do is just copy and paste the query from our, let's do it from our blog post page. And let's alter it here in our post slug.js page. So we set up our query variable, and the first thing we're going to do is we need to give the query a name. So we're going to pass an argument or create a variable for our query to get individual posts by their slug. And inside the parentheses where the argument lies, we're going to define our variable, which is slug with string type, and it's going to be required. So let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. So we're going to use the query keyword. We're going to give the name for the query to be post. And this is where we're defining our variable, string type. And we are going to add an exclamation point to make it required. And then what I'm going to do is pretty much copy and paste this here. Let's format. Okay, doesn't format well right now. And then inside of that, we are going to um, pass that variable into our where clause exactly how we did here. So actually what we can do is copy and paste this whole thing here. format document. And what we need to do is change the where clause to use the variable that we created. So where slug will now equal that slug variable. It can be a little confusing, but if you go into the documentation and read what Next.js has created to explain the concept, it makes it a lot easier to understand as well as doing to learn. So once you do it over and over again, you'll begin to understand what's actually going on. All right, so we've created our query for our singular post for our dynamic pages. And now what we're going to do is do our get static props with a params argument. So the params argument contains the route parameter, and the params argument is an object. So since our page name is slug.js, the params will be an object that has a slug property with a value. That's a lot, but there's documentation to explain that further. So the first thing we need to do is start with our get static prop. So we're going to do the export async function, get static props. We're going to add our params argument, if I can spell it right. And the first thing we're going to do is to define the slug variable where we're going to get the slug value from the params object and a slug property. So const slug equals params dot slug. Then we're going to define our request like we did in our more static pages where the content isn't dynamic in a sense. So const data equals await query. So in this request, we're not only going to just define the request, we're also going to define the slug variable. All right. And now we're going to add an additional variable that down the line just cuts out some of the text so that we don't have to, I guess, duplicate some of our typing. And you'll see exactly what I'm talking about in a second. So data.post. All right. And finally, for get static prop, we're also going to have our return statement. And in the return statement, we are going to return post. Okay, let me just make sure I set that up how it should be set up. Okay. And we're going to save it. So now that we have our get static props together to pull the post content, now we need to pull our paths for the post, which is where get static paths come in. So we have to create another query for our get static path function, and I'm actually going to put it above get static props, and it's going to be export const, I'm going to call it slug list because that's what we're trying to get, is a list of the slugs for all of the posts so that we can query our specific slug from that list. So it's going to be set up the same way as the other query. So GQL and post. And the only thing we want to query from here is slug. We just want a list of all the slugs for the blog post. Okay. So then we're going to create a destructure blog post variable as our request within the slug list query in our get static paths function. All right, and we're gonna add that function after the get static props. So export async function get static const post. And in the description for the video, I put a link to all of the different documentation and specific topics for further reading or explanation. So if you need to understand it a little bit better or you want to read up on your own, definitely check the link down or the links in the description down below to help uh, get a little bit more clarification or if you just need better understanding. So we create that first destructured blog post variable for posts, and then we are gonna create a return as well, or add a return. So in the return, what we do is we have two required items that go in the return. The first being path, which we will use the map function to find the path we want based on the post we want to render. And then the second required component is fallback. And we're going to set it to blocking. And this has to do with the path rendering behavior. Again, links to documentation to explain that in a little bit more detail will be in the description below. So paths. We're gonna do post.map. Post is our item. And for each post, we're gonna map the slug for that post. Slug where slug equals that post slug. And then fallback, blocking. All right. So now what we need to do is test it out. So in our post function or functional component, we need to add the parameter post singular. And in the div, we're just going to add some dummy content. So we are going to use post.title. So if we hadn't created that extra variable, what we would have had to do for all of our items is double post. So post dot whatever the field or item is you want to query. So this just again cuts down on some of that typing that I was talking about. So let's see if this works in the website. So let's go to new blog post. Okay. And right now we don't see it. Let's see what happened. Oh, it's because we didn't actually add title to the query. So let's see what happens now. There we go. So now we have the new blog post title. Okay, so now that we know that it is working, we can add some of the other items. So first, we already have the title. In the second div, what we want to add is, let's format the document, make sure everything is formatted correctly. So in our second div, we want to add, yeah, let's do it within this one. Let's add post.author.name. Okay. And next, let's format this. Okay. And after that, let's add our actual post content. So we're gonna put in post HTML. All right, so now we have our blog post title, we have the author's name, and we have our content, but it's not looking like how we want. And how we fix this is with using the attribute dangerously set inner HTML attribute within a div tag. So that is going to look like this: div dangerously set inner HTML. Oops, we just need two HTML post.content.html. Oh, we forgot to close the div out. All right, so now it's looking a little bit more like what we expect. So we're using this attribute to populate our div content from our rich text editor that we use in Graph CMS. Usually using inner HTML is dangerous because it leaves your app open for scripting attacks. That's why they require the dangerously part to be added to the name. However, in this case, it's okay because we know the source of truth where we're getting our data, and our element is not executing any type of script. So we should be good to go. So rendering the content as HTML is super simple, but clearly we still have some styling to do, and we'll do that when we get to that bulk of the styling part of the tutorial with Tailwind CSS and also Next.js and module.css files. But before we move on to styling, let's do a little bit more copying and pasting for the projects page. So it's going to be, again, very similar to this, which is why we want to do mostly copy and paste. So let's format this document. Let's copy all of this. Let's save it. We don't want to lose this work that we created. We can copy and paste. So we have our nav bar, we have our GraphQL imports, we have the endpoint. Let's go back to the API playground. Let's change to individual project. I don't even know what projects I created in the content, so let's pick a project. New project, simple. Let's go back to the playground where slug is, and also it doesn't like that space. And then also what we want to do is pull the ID, pull the slug, pull the title, pull the description, pull the project image and its URL, and then we also want to pull that demo URL as well as the source URL. Let's test it out. This is what we want. So what we're gonna do is copy this, the inner workings, content, and paste. Let's format this. We are going to change anywhere where it says post to projects. Well, before I do that, projects. And I don't want to do this because I don't want it to change something incorrectly. So I'll just do the legwork. Actually, Okay. And you can use the search and find, but like I said, I don't want it to incorrectly change something, so I'm okay with just doing that extra typing for this just to make sure it's exactly what I want. Okay, so now that we are here, let's change this to project, the actual function name. So now that we are here, we don't need to use dangerously set inner HTML because we didn't use the rich text editor for our projects. It's very straightforward at this point. So we are going to change this to project title. We are going to change this to project. We don't need project author. So this will be, let's see, we got project title, project description. We can delete this. Um, and then we will need, I actually want the project image to be right before the description. So image, I don't think we added that import. Let's see if it'll automatically add it. No. We need to add the image import. Cool. And we need to add our property. So source equals project image.url. Again, we're going to give it an alt attribute, which is going to be project image, very simple, width equals 150, actually 300, height equals 300. Let's format the page nicely. Okay, so we have our title, our image, our description, and now what we want to do is add links for that um, demo URL and our source URL. So we need that link, and I think it added it for us. Yep. So we need that link component. href equals project demo URL. Is it all caps? Oh, no, it is not all caps. Demo URL. A caps demo. And then we need that second link for the source URL. Okay, and I think that's it. So let's go to our project or our site, and let's click on new project and see if, there we go. We have our content dynamically generated. So this is good. So far, we've set up our navigation bar, we set up our home page, we set up our project page, we set up our blog page, and we've also set up dynamically generated pages for each individual blog post as well as each individual project. So this is great. So the next thing we need to do is on the homepage, we need to generate content for these placeholders. So let's go ahead and do that. Our content for our project and blog section on the homepage or our index.js page will pretty much be the same as how we generated content on those individual landing pages for blogs and projects. Just small nuanced differences. So let's go ahead and open up our index.js file. And again, what we need to start with is we need to actually add a couple of imports again, which would be the GraphQL imports, link, and image. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm actually just going to copy and paste from our blog page. Okay, so now that we have our imports, obviously the next thing is our endpoints. So let's go ahead and grab that endpoint as well. And copy and paste that there. And now we just need to create a query for both posts and projects. So let's go back into the API playground. Let's go into posts first. And what we need is the ID for all posts. We need the name of our post. Oh, no, we need the title. So we need the title, we need the cover photo and its URL, and I think that's all we need for posts. And now for projects, we need pretty much the same exact thing. So we need a project ID, title, slug. We don't need slug. ID, title. Yes, we do need slug. That's how we're gonna use that for our links to the pages. So let's go back up to post and add slug. Where are we? Mm, I'll just manually add it. I can't find it. My eyes aren't working right now. And back to projects, we are going to add project image and the project image URL. So let's test it. Okay, this is cool. This is the content we want to generate. So what we need to do is I'm going to take the query variable from our blog page. We're going to paste it here. The only thing is we're going to replace that main content of the query with this. All right. So now it's time to set up our get static props. So export async function, get static props, cons. And this time we need to set up the variables for both posts and projects. Equals a wait for our request query. All right, and when we return, we're going to return for both posts and projects. All right. Okay, I think that is all we needed to do. Okay, and now we're going to add our posts and projects parameters into our home function. And at this point, we're going to move down to the project area and we are actually going to set up the card structure. So we're going to give the layout, it's going to have a grid layout with 3 columns. So class name, grid 3. And next we are going to do some conditional rendering, and we are also going to use the slice and map function to list 3 posts. So within that conditional rendering, we're going to add our card structure, which is a div with an image and an h2 tag for the project name that will also link to the individual project's page. So let's go ahead and do that. All right. So we have that, and in here, we're gonna delete this good stuff. And There we go. Conditional render projects dot slice. So we can get 3 posts. 3. And then we're gonna map ID. We need the ID. We need the name. We need slug. Sorry, we need title. Slug project image. All right, and then from here, this is where we're going to generate the actual cards, or the structure for each individual card. So we're going to have a div. Remember, we need that key um, attribute. We're going to have h2 tag for the title, which will also be a link to the individual project page. href template literal. So we're going to add that projects, I think project path, and we're going to add that slug variable. I think that's all we needed for here. And then a tag is going to be title. All right. And then under our h2 tag is where we're going to add the image. So we need the source. Oops, that is not what we need. Source attribute project image.url width of 150, height of 150, oops, equals, and close that tag. And let's check this out. So I think that's all we needed to do. Undefined property of slice. Let's see. Make sure that's an actual error. Okay, so we just needed to refresh. Okay, so this is what we want. It's still not styled yet, but it is exactly what we want. We wanted the 3 card sections. So now let's do pretty much the same thing for latest blog post, just we don't have to do as much of the formatting because we're not putting it in cards. So we're just gonna put it in a 2 grid, or yeah, a 2 column grid layout. So here we're going to give it class name and utilities grid 2. All right. And we are going to post that slice 0 to 2 because we only want to list 2 of the blog posts. Dot map. We need ID, title, slug. All right, and then div that key attribute ID, and inside of that we're just going to have h2 tags for the title with links. Why do I keep doing that? Post slash the slug variable. Oh, excuse me, I'm all over the place. Okay, close that, add our a tag and title. I think that is all we need. Yep. So now we see that our latest articles have been added, and they lead to the pages we want them to lead to, their individual pages. So now that we have all of our data, load it onto our site, we can start styling. And fair warning, the styling is going to be super basic. However, and there also be a little bit of repetition. So I know against it goes against all the rules of, reducing repetition or no do not repeat. However, it's gonna be basic, but a good intro into Tailwind CSS, Next.js, and CSS support, and that goes for the repetition piece as well. It shows you repetitively um, Tailwind CSS utilities and how to use them, so that you can get a good basic understanding of how to use Tailwind CSS. All right, let's start with the styling. All right, now to make our site look prettier, give it some zhuzh, make it visually appealing. So we're going to start using Tailwind CSS and some Next.js to do this. So let's start with our index.js page or our home page. So first, what I want to do is I want a dark theme, so I'm going to change the whole website to have a black background. So I'm going to go into the global CSS file. So let's close, minimize that. Styles, not ESLint. Global CSS file. And what I am going to do is set the default background color for the site using base styles. And layer base is going to do that. So HTML at apply, which you can use, makes it so that you can use utility classes in these CSS files. So apply background, see how that popped up, the utility helper, black. So now we see pretty much nothing except for photos because everything is black. And honestly, that's what I want. I wanted that dark theme. So we can close out of that. So now let's go into our function. So in the we're going to tackle the hero section first. But for the overall parent div, we're going to add some utilities because we want the component to be to have a full screen width, a height of 100, and to make all the text on a page white. So let's do class with screen h full text white. Save that, and now we can see our content again. So next, we'll give the nested div after the navbar component some padding and a height of the screen view, or actually a height of full. Let's do that. So class before height full. So we wanted 100% the height of the parent div. Okay, better. So we've already given the hero section a little bit of styling as far as how the content is laid out, but let's just add some more visual elements to it. So what we're gonna do is change the title to be pink, make it bigger, and the font weight bolder. So what we're gonna do is the H2 tag is class name, text, pink, 600. Text, I'm gonna set it to 2XL. And then font, I want it extra bold. All right, cool. So one last thing I want to do to make the div with my name and blurb stack on top of each other with smaller views like on a phone um, is, or I want to make it responsive. So this is done by using the responsive modifier sm colon for small. So first we'll state what we want the column layout to be for anything smaller than that breakpoint, which will be a one column grid. And then we'll add the modifier so that anything higher or larger than that breakpoint, we want it to be split into this two column grid. So right now, if we make it smaller, it still looks like this. That's not what we want. We want it to stack on top of each other. So this is actually what I'm talking about. So when we go back up to, let's see, when we go back up to our main div holding our two grid columns, what we want to do is add grid calls 1. So this is saying that anything smaller than the breakpoint, we're going to stack it. And that modifier I was adding or talking about is SM colon. So what this is doing is anything larger than that small breakpoint is going to have a 2-column layout. So let's save that and see if it worked. Okay. So you see when we adjusted the screen to be smaller than that small breakpoint, it stacks the columns instead of having them side by side, which is what we want. I think it'll be easier to view on a mobile device stacked versus if it was still side by side. Okay. So now we can move on to the about section. So for the entire div, I'm going to add some margin to, well, not for the entire div. For the div, I'm going to add margin to the bottom section. So not the whole thing, just the bottom. Let me make sure. Okay. Class. So MB stands for margin bottom. I'm just going to set it to 4. So now it breaks up those sections. And the as far as the section titles, I kind of want to make it so it has like a knockout text look. So we're gonna make the text black, the background pink. The text will be larger. We're gonna add some padding, some bottom margins, and make the font extra bold. So let's go ahead to our H2 tag. Class name equals text black, background pink, that same pink 600. We are going to make it larger, so I think 2XL should be cool. We are going to add some padding around the whole thing. We're going to add some bottom margins so that it can be separated from the other piece of content, so that paragraph. And we're going to make the font extra bold. Let's see if we like how that turns out. Okay, cool. And pretty much this is going to be the same for projects and latest articles as well. So now let's go ahead and move on to projects. What we can do is copy and paste the class utilities and just add that to projects. Let's say that. Perfect. Now for the card section, we're gonna make the height for the container 100 and place the cards in the center of the container, both vertically and horizontally. We're gonna add some bottom margin, and we're also gonna change the layout for the mobile view to stack, just like we did our hero section. So let's go ahead and do that. So for the div, let's go ahead and add our responsive part. So grid call 1. Let's add that breakpoint modifier. And then H4, because like I said, we want it 100%. We want to place items center, because we want it center vertically and horizontally. And what else do we want to do? Oh, we wanted to add some bottom margin. Okay, good. That's what I want. Now, for each individual card, we're going to give it a grid layout with one column and place item center. We will also style the name of the app as pink, make it bigger, add some weight to it, and then we're going to give the card box the card a box shadow, some type of little off-whitish grayish color, and then on hover we're going to have it change to a lighter pink color. Additionally, we're going to add a little bit of margin and make the background of the card dark gray, just so we can see it, because our pictures have a black background for the most part, so we can't really see what's going on. So let's go ahead and do that. I also want to make the cards rounded, so I want their edges or corners to be a little rounded. So what we're going to do is, in our div with the key, because that's the main div for each individual card, I'm going to give it some utilities. Um, like I said, I wanted the corners to be rounded. Grid, grid, one, place items, center. And like I said, I think this is where I should put the shadow. First, let's save this. Let's see what this looks like. Okay, cool. So now I want to add a shadow. And I want it to be, let's start with medium first. I want the shadow color to be, let's see what, mm, let's see what white looks like first. Let's see. Actually, I'm not mad at the white, so we're gonna keep the white. And then shadow on hover. So for hovering or that type of hover animation, we can use the hover keyword or the hover prefix to add what we want to happen on hover. So what we want to happen is to change the shadow color on hover, which we want to give it a pink, but not that bold dark pink we've had, more of a lighter pink. So let's try 300. Um, let's see. That's pretty cool. And then we want to add some margin at the top and bottom. Just to separate it from that title and from anything under it just a little bit. And we also want to add some padding so that we're able to um, see the roundedness of the card. So padding 3, and let's see. Okay. And you know what? I'm not gonna add a gray. Let me see what the background gray looks like. Background gray 900. Okay, yeah, we can add the background gray 900. It separates that background from the actual photo so we can actually see our photo a little bit more clearly. So we can keep that. I think that looks pretty good. So I'm going to leave that alone. So now the next thing is our latest blog section. Again, the setup for the title of the section is going to be the same. So we'll just copy and paste those class utilities. Let's save that. Perfect. And then after that, what we want to do is change. All we want to do is change the text size and color and weight for the titles of the blog post. So we're just going to do that here. Class name, text, pink, 600. Text, we're gonna make it stick with the 2XL, and font bold is fine. Okay. And actually I do want to add actually, you know what, let's do text pink on hover, but yeah, let's do text pink on hover. Cool. That way we, it's an indicator of what we're hovering or placing our mouse over. Now, one thing I did not do is style the navigation bar. So let's close out of that. We're done with the home page. Let's go to our components and nav. And what I want to do is give this some color. So I actually want this to be text pink as well. I want it to be text bold or font bold. Okay. Um, Actually, I want it to be extra bold. There we go. And I want the, let's see, I'll leave it here for now. I think I may want to make those bold. For right now, I'm gonna leave it how it is so we can save that. All right, cool. So we're done with the home page. Let's move on to the blog and project page for styling. So let's go to blog first. Let's close out the nav bar um, and open our blog main page. All right. So the overall parent div is going to be styled the exact same for all the pages. So class name, width of screen, height 100, so H full, and all the text will be white. Perfect. So for the hero section, it's going to be a grid layout, and we're going to add some padding, a pink border, and give it a height to make it wider and center the content. And it's going to be very similar to the knockout text for those sections on the home page, just bigger. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do our hero section with blog. So give it a class name, grid. Let's add some padding, border. Let's add a border. Border color will be pink. That same pink 600. Let's give it some height. Also, there's no rhyme or reason of how I chose the height for or at least for the hero sections. It was just what I thought looked visually appealing to me. So do what you see fit, make it your own. All right. So now for our H2 component, we are going to make the text black, background pink. Text is going to be pretty big, so let's go all the way up to 9XL, and we want the font to be extra bold. Let's see what we got. That's what I wanted. Okay, so now for the list of the blog posts. What we're going to do is assign a grid layout. We're going to place the content center, and then within the div, so within that conditional rendering, we're going to set the layout to a grid with two columns. So one side is going to have the image, one side is going to have the title. So let's go ahead and do that. So this, not this div, the div. Let's make sure I put it in the right spot. Okay, yeah. So this div class name, grid, place, center. All right, that's exactly what we wanted right there. And now for the, not the key div, but the one right under it, we're gonna set that to a 2-column grid. That's exactly what we wanted. So this is how I want it listed. And now for the titles, so the blog post titles, what I want to do is make them pink, make them bigger, make them bolder. All right, so class. Okay, that's exactly what I wanted. Nice. Okay, so now we're pretty much done with that for the main blog page. One thing I did want to do is add a little bit of padding around this actual list area. So let's go ahead and do that. I think, yeah, let's add some margin. So let's do M2. Let's do M4. Okay, that is nice. Okay, yes, that is what I want. All right. So now we can move on to the project main page. Pretty much all of this is going to be the same thing. So side note, there are definitely shortcuts to use with Tailwind CSS and just CSS in general to reduce repetition and copying and pasting. I am fully aware of that, and I'm fully aware that this is not the only way or necessarily the most efficient way to style our project. However, I do want you to see the basics. Repetition is good for learning. Um, and I can do a video on ways to use Tailwind CSS more efficiently if you would like. So just let me know in the comments below if you want to see how to do that. But I just wanted to put out that disclaimer. I know there's a lot of repetition going on. I know it's not efficient. I know there are other shortcuts and ways. However, it is out of the scope of this tutorial, and I wanted to just keep it very simple. Okay, so before we move on to styling our dynamic pages, let's do the main post page, sorry, main project page really quick, just so it can mimic our blog post page and so we can see what's going on with that. Let's actually move this to the side. Let's minimize that a little bit so I can see what I'm doing. All right. So that is pretty much it for the projects page. So we have our blog main page, we have our projects main page, we have our home with some styling, and it looks 1,000 times better than what it did at the beginning. So now let's start generating um, the styling or start setting up the styling for our dynamic content pages for blog posts. Cool. So let's start styling the blog content or the dynamic post content, that page that we created. So we're gonna go into slug.js. Let's actually, well, so right now here is one of our content pages. We can't see anything, so let's see something. Again, it's gonna be the same parent layout. So class name with screen H full text white. All right, so now we can see the content that we generated from out of Graph CMS. So we're gonna style the H2 tag very in the author or the paragraph tag for the author name very simply how we style the other components for the other pages. However, the post.content HTML um, is a little bit different. So we're going to style that using component level CSS. So component level CSS files with Next.js have a naming convention where it's whatever your given name is for the file .module.css. So we're going to add that to our components folder. So we're going to call this file post.module.css. Okay, so this CSS module file can be used anywhere in the app. And for a deeper understanding of CSS modules, I've added links in the description box for you to check out. So now if we look back at our blog post, so let me show you what it looked like before we added the div in the set inner HTML. So it gave us plain HTML markup. So we see we have some H1 tags, we have a paragraph tag, and we have an unordered list tag and some list items. So we're going to style those components using that post.module.css file. So let's clear this back out. And I said we had H1, H2, some paragraph, and unordered list and list items. We're going to uncomment this. Okay, so let's go into our post module CSS file. And the format for the post module CSS is a name. The format name is a class ID or selector, the element, curly brackets, and inside of those curly brackets, we use that apply keyword to allow us to use the Tailwind CSS classes and utilities, and the utilities we want to style. So let's go ahead and do that. So we want to give it a class ID selector, and I'm just gonna call it dot post. Let's start with our paragraph element. We're going to style that. So we're going to add apply so we can use our Tailwind utilities. We're going to give it a margin top and bottom of 2. And we're going to make the text small. Pretty simple. Next, we're going to style the H1 elements. Add apply. Actually, I'm going to copy and paste. The only thing is the text is going to be 5XL, text pink, 600, font extra bold. Okay, and for the H2 is gonna be pretty similar. We just need to change the text size so we can differentiate between H1 elements and H2 elements. So that is gonna drop to 3XL. Okay. Um, let's stop there and then we'll deal with the list items. So now what we want to do is go back to our dynamic post page, and what we need to do is add the class name attribute to our content div. So let's go class name. And what we want to do in curly braces is add template literals and our class selector name and our variable for styles.post. So delete that. Curly braces. Our backticks post, since that was our class name we gave it, and then the variable styles. Okay. So one thing we need to do is we did not import that file yet. So we need to go back to the top and import our post module file. So we're going to import styles from dot dot components slash post dot module dot css. Okay. So now we see our styles added for the actual post content. So now we need to actually, it's hard to see, but it's not, you can definitely see that it's not styled the same way as the rest of the content. So let's go ahead and style the unordered list. So we're going to do post UL and at apply, and we can give it the margin as well. I want it to be text. Let's do text small and let's leave it at that. Okay. And for me, that's fine. I think that's good. We don't need to do anything with the list, the actual list items at this point. All right. So now let's go ahead and do a little bit more styling. We don't want everything from end to end. So let's add some margin to the entire div holding our author name and post content. So div, actually, yeah, let's see. Class name M8. Okay, cool. The only thing is our new blog post doesn't have margin. So I'm actually going to add that into this. There we go. And I definitely want to make the author name smaller. So class name text extra small. Nice. And I want to make the title bigger, pink, and bolder. So class name text pink 600 font extra bold, and I want to make it pretty big. So we're going to go 9XL. Yep, that's pretty big. But I like it like that, so I'm going to leave it like that. So that is pretty much it for styling our dynamic post pages using Next.js as well as module CSS file or a module CSS file. Now what we're going to do is style our dynamic project pages. So actually I just want to kind of look and see what each one looks like. That's pretty cool. Okay, so we can go back to our project pages. So let's close out of um, the slug for post as well as the post.module.css. Let's go into our project folder and our slug page for projects. So what we're gonna do in that first div, that parent div, let's format this a little bit. Okay, that is formatted. In the parent div, what we're gonna do is class name, same thing. Okay, so now we see our content. We're going to give the parent div some margin. And when I say parent div, I mean the div of our content. So let's add, actually, project title. Okay. And then what we want to do is the same thing with our project title, bigger, bolder, pinker. Pink, yeah, pinker. Class name. Okay. And then lastly, we will style our links to change on hover to pink and give them some space between each other. And we also want, I actually want them a little bit bigger and bolder too. So let's do that. So for each link, I want it to be bolder. So We're gonna do it on the actual link. Class name, hover, text, pink, 600. Okay, text center. Let's see if that adds some space. Nope. Let's just add some padding then. Padding 2. Okay, cool. Um, let's do padding right. PR. There we go. And then for this one, pretty much the same thing. Okay, and then I think I want to make it bolder, so font bold. Nice. All right. So yes, and let's make sure our links are working. Good. We see that down in that bottom left corner, we see where the external link is targeting towards. So that is exactly what we want. And that is it. We are done. This is great. So let's go back and look at what we've done. So home, we have our hero section, we have our about, we have our list of project cards with a little razzle dazzle with some shadows and hovering. Same thing with the blog post title that leads to our individual dynamically generated blog post pages. We have our main list page for our projects. We have our main blog page for our projects. I'm actually going to get out of this full screen for both and make this full screen so you can actually see what all we got going on here. And this is how you can build a portfolio with a blog component using Next.js. And that is it. With the use of Next.js, GraphCMS, a dash of GraphQL, and Tailwind CSS, we now have a fully functioning portfolio site with a blog component. So here's the challenge for you. Take this tutorial and create something original, something uniquely you. Try out different stylings, try out different animations and libraries, add responsiveness, add a contact form, add a comment section, whatever it is, just make it yours. Think about how you can change the code to remove repetition or make it easier to read or more efficient. I know during the process of creating this tutorial, I have already made changes to my portfolio project. So, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you want to see more of in the comments down below, and looking forward to the next one.